What's up, guys? This is VinylicPuma, and today I figured it could be fun to talk about whatever happened to Japan and the Japanese in the Fallout universe. While we have a vague idea of what has happened to places like China, as well as many other European and Middle Eastern countries, Japan is barely ever mentioned throughout the Fallout games, despite being a major United States ally in the real world. And this is obviously really bizarre, given that Japan currently possesses one of the largest economies in the world, and aspects of Japanese culture have had a considerable impact globally. In this video, I'm going to talk about what we know about Japan both in the Fallout universe as well as in the real world, and then speculate as to what happened to them and why the Japanese never ended up appearing in any of the Fallout games. So without further ado, let's go ahead and discuss how Japan is referenced throughout the Fallout games. While there's not a whole lot we know about Japan in the Fallout universe, there are many things that are associated with Japan that appear throughout the games. For example, during the events of Fallout 2, the player can encounter Yakuza that are operating around the outskirts of New Reno, and these Yakuza carry around short samurai swords known as wakizashi. Plus, there are also a few small references to Japan in Fallout New Vegas and Fallout 4's weapons. In New Vegas, the player can obtain a katana that they can use in combat, while in Fallout 4, the player can obtain the shish kebab, which appears to be based on a samurai's wakizashi short sword, just like what Fallout 2's Yakuza might use. However, I would say that Fallout 3 has the most infamous reference to Japan in the form of an NPC from the Mothership Zeta DLC named Toshiro Kago. For those of you that haven't played the DLC, Toshiro is a 1500s Japanese samurai that was abducted by the Zetan aliens and is often considered to not only be the oldest living character in the franchise, but also one of the most fleshed out Japanese NPCs in the entire series. Unfortunately for us, while Toshiro is indeed Japanese, he wasn't present to witness what happened to Japan leading up to the Great War, nor has he experienced what post-Great War Japan is like. The closest the player gets to a post-war Japanese NPC is Takahashi from Fallout 4, who unfortunately can only really ask the player what they would like to order in Japanese. However, there is a mentioned NPC that we are aware of from Fallout 3 who goes by the name of Sakugama Okiri. Now, Sakugama was presumably Japanese or of Japanese descent and served as the last president of the United Nations before it was disbanded in 2052. Interestingly, Sakugama can give us some insight into the state of the Fallout universe because he makes a statement in an article titled United Nations Disbanded, where he says the following: "It is a sad day for the United States, sadder still for the world. An era of relative peace and prosperity has come to a tragic end. The resource wars are upon us, and in my humble opinion, the United Nations is needed more than ever. Sadly, the world disagrees." While we will get into more of the significance of this particular quote later on in this video, it is worth mentioning that the United Nations is recorded as disbanding in 2052, and shortly after this occurred, the resource wars kicked into gear. After that, you had the Great War in 2077, and then the Fallout games themselves starting in 2161. Ultimately, though, there's not a whole lot we know about Japan in the Fallout universe. However, it is safe to say that certain historical events that occurred during and leading up to the end of World War II did occur in the Fallout universe. For example, it's safe to say that the Japanese did attack Pearl Harbor in 1941, thus involving the United States in World War II. And we can basically confirm through Fallout 4's intro cutscene that the United States did end up dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thus ending World War II like we did in our own real-world timeline. After the events of World War II, it's difficult to say what exactly happened to Japan because at some point, the timeline in the Fallout universe diverges from our own. With that said, if I had to predict the point of divergence, my guess would be that it could be as late as 1962. And this is because one of the songs that plays on Diamond City Radio in Fallout 4 is called The End of the World by Skeeter Davis. And this song just so happened to be released in 1962 in our very own timeline. With that said, I'm going to put the divergence at some time in the early 60s because of the fact that a number of rifles that appear in Fallout New Vegas, like the service rifle and assault carbine, appeared to be based on the real-world Armalite AR-15, which would later become the Colt AR-15, and both of these rifles were introduced in 1959 and 1963 respectively. Though to make things more complicated, one of the earliest divergences from our timeline compared to Fallout's is America's 1961 spaceflight. In the Fallout universe, Carl Bell piloted Defiance 7 in a suborbital spaceflight on May 5, 1961, where in our real world, it was astronaut Alan Shepard who piloted the Freedom 7 on the exact same day. So I suppose if you're skeptical, it's possible that minor differences in the timeline started to become noticeable in the years before 1961. However, it's safe to say that they had fully manifested by 1969, when the United States is divided into the Fallout universe's 13 commonwealths. But I digress. What I'm getting at with all of this is that it's likely that many of the same real-world events that involve Japan in our real-world timeline also occurred in the Fallout timeline up until the early 1960s. For that reason, it's likely that the Treaty of San Francisco and the Security Treaty between the United States and Japan were both signed in 1952. For the uninitiated, the Treaty of San Francisco officially ended the Allied occupation of Japan, while the Security Treaty granted the United States territory to establish a military presence in Japan and also prevented Japan from granting those same rights to other nations without the consent of the United States. So, more or less, I think it's fair to suggest that Japan's relationship with the United States in our current timeline is likely the same as it would be in the Fallout universe, where both countries are allies. Though, let's go into more depth concerning Japan's development between the mid-40s and early 60s. In our timeline, Japan experienced rapid economic growth in the years leading up to the early 1960s due to the actions of its first prime minister, Shigeru Yoshida. Yoshida would implement what would become known as the Yoshida Doctrine, which was a policy in which Japan would rely on the United States military when it came to matters of defense, while Japan could focus all of its efforts on economic recovery. As a result, Japan's economy essentially exploded and would ultimately develop into one of the world's largest economies. In fact, it wasn't until fairly recently in 2011 that Japan lost its title as being the world's second largest economy to China, and at the time of making this video, it is currently the world's third largest economy. Now, while Japan does rely on the United States when it comes to military matters, Japan did establish its own military organization in the form of the JSDF, or Japan Self-Defense Forces. Now, the reason the organization is named this way is due to Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which forbids Japan from not only using force to settle international disputes, but also prevents them from maintaining a traditional army, navy, and air force. Thus, the JSDF functions sort of like a greatly enhanced police force. However, in terms of military power and according to globalfirepower.com, Japan currently ranks as the 7th strongest quote-unquote military in the world. To put this in perspective, this is behind several European countries like France and the United Kingdom, while slightly ahead of other countries like Turkey and Germany. And while the JSDF has been deployed overseas occasionally since the 1990s, their deployments usually consist of very small groups, and they rarely ever participate in the fighting. So while I think it's fair to say that the Japanese have a military in a certain sense, it's more often used for peacekeeping and national relief efforts as opposed to actual warfare. As all of this information pertains to the Fallout universe, I think it's fair to say that the Japanese economy was likely quite strong in the Fallout universe before the Great War occurred. Assuming the divergence occurred sometime in the early 1960s, the Yoshida Doctrine would have likely been implemented by that time, thus allowing the Japanese economy to flourish. I also think it's fair to say that while the Japanese would be capable of being a military power during the Resource Wars, Japan's current laws and economic strategies are set up in such a way that they tend to rely on the United States when it comes to foreign policy and defense. So when it comes to the subject of China, there is a strong possibility that China and Japan could have a hostile relationship in the Fallout universe because of how Japan is traditionally a United States ally. It's also worth mentioning that historically speaking, China and Japan haven't always had the best of relationships, and while things are largely better now in our own timeline, Japan has been accused by China of committing a number of atrocities against Chinese citizens in the Second World War. And as this pertains to the Fallout universe, these atrocities could be used as fuel for anti-Japanese sentiment during the Resource Wars. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is that it's more likely that Japan is going to ally with the United States than they will with China in the Fallout universe. The question is, will Japan and the United States continue to be allies once the Resource Wars start? Now, earlier on in this video, I said that I would get back to a quote from a mentioned NPC in Fallout 3 named Sakugama Okiri. His quote was commenting on the sad state of affairs and how much of the peace and prosperity that had governed the world since the end of World War II had finally come to an end. That same United Nations disbanded article mentions something else that is fairly interesting in the very first sentence, where it specifically reads, and I quote, "In a crushing blow to foreign relations and world peace, the United Nations yesterday was completely disbanded, leaving its member nations to fend for themselves." This line of dialogue would seem to imply that Japan may no longer be an ally of the United States at the start of the Resource Wars, and thus, Japan is left to fend for itself. However, at the same time, it doesn't seem like the United States would just cut and run because Japan is an ally of the United States and is a good logistical center for the US military to potentially invade China if they choose to do so. It's hard to say what would happen here, but if the US was smart, and I'm inclined to think that they would be in this case, it would be in the United States' best interest to maintain their military presence in Japan if they are able to. Though I will admit that they may not be able to because they may not have the resources to do so. But at this point, I'm sure you're probably wondering, what happened to Japan? Well, as far as I see it, one of two different scenarios would have likely occurred in the pre-war period that would have affected Japan in the post-war period. The first scenario involves the United States and Japan continuing to remain allies, while the second scenario would be the United States effectively abandoning Japan as its ally, leaving it to an uncertain fate. If the US remains allied with Japan, Japan's fate would largely be tied to that of the United States, meaning that they could likely remain a relatively peaceful nation until the events of the Great War occurred. Japan would likely provide aid to the United States, while Japan would benefit from the US's military protection, just like they have since the Allied occupation of Japan ended. However, just like the United States, Japan would certainly be bombed by the Chinese in this scenario, and it's likely that the Chinese would be targeting many of America's military bases in Japan. Since there are many American bases around the Tokyo area, it's likely that much of Tokyo would be bombed, along with many other population centers like Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, and Kyoto as well. It's also safe to say that with the US military presence in Japan, that a lot of US military hardware would be located in Japan even after the bombs themselves fell. For that reason, it's possible that you might see the various Japanese post-war factions with everything from suits of West Tech power armor to United States weapons tech like the Fat Man or the AER-9 laser rifle. Now, if the US abandoned Japan, it's likely that Japan would be overrun by China. This is largely because Japan doesn't have a large standing military, and while the JSDF would be modernized and could be effective at repelling the Chinese for a time, I think that the Japanese would end up having issues contending with the sheer manpower of the Chinese. Plus, when you consider that China has the third strongest military in the world, Japan may have a bit of problem being only the seventh largest quote-unquote military in the world. Assuming the Chinese successfully captured Japan, China would basically inherit the US's former military bases in and around Japan. This could prove to be somewhat of a logistical advantage to the Chinese in the sense that it would make it easier for the Chinese to eventually invade Alaska. By holding Japanese territory, the Chinese could invade Alaska's Aleutian Islands, then make their way towards the Alaskan Peninsula, and then end up in Anchorage just like we've seen in the games. In the post-war era, I think it's fair to suggest that the Japanese islands are likely ravaged by war, provided that the US abandons them at the start of the resource wars. Not only would significant amounts of Japan be destroyed when the Chinese initially invade, but it's fair to say that the United States would likely have to fight the Chinese again on Japanese soil, leading to even more destruction. As a result, I think post-war Japan would be in a really rough state. If you figure that many of the locations we've experienced in the Fallout games were relatively well intact before the bombs dropped, try to imagine a situation where the same areas were utterly destroyed from warfare and then the bombs dropped. Things would go from bad to worse, and it's likely that it may take a lot of time to recover from all of that devastation. Regardless of whichever scenario actually happened, Japan will likely be isolated for a long time after the Great War, and this is predominantly because Japan is mostly a group of islands, and you would need a functional boat in order to get to and from Japan. It's also possible that Japan may have reverted into a bunch of small warring states, sort of like we've seen with the Sengoku period before Japan was unified in the year 1600. However, instead of seeing medieval samurai fighting each other, imagine battles that would more accurately represent modern warfare. At the end of the day, though, I do find it weird that Japan is barely mentioned in any of the Fallout games, outside of some cultural references. While the Japanese Yakuza appear to some degree in Fallout 2, I'm sort of surprised that we don't hear much more about the Japanese other than that. And my hope is that we'll get to encounter some Japanese characters or some characters of Japanese descent in future Fallout games, especially if they take place on the West Coast. But until then, guys, I think that's going to pretty much wrap up this particular video. If you liked this video, feel free to leave a like. And as always, take care, and I'll see you all next time.